The wagon came up the north road at dusk, and Nathaniel Cole stood on the porch of Larkspur Station, counting the lamps he had lit that evening, because counting things was easier than admitting he did not know what he was waiting for. He had placed the advertisement 6 weeks before in careful block letters copied twice, so the ink would not smear in the mail pouch. Wanted a capable woman to keep house at a stage station, cook for travelers, and see to a young girl. Marriage expected. Serious inquiries only. He had written it the way he wrote everything, plainly, because he distrusted words that tried to be more than what they described. What he wanted, if he was honest with himself, in the particular silence of the hour before supper, was someone who could sit at the head of his table without flinching at the size of the room or the strangers who filled it 3 times a week when the coach came through. If you have ever wondered what a house becomes when it is built for guests but has no one to welcome them, stay with this one to the end, because the answer arrived that evening in a plain gray dress with a single trunk and did not resemble anything Nathaniel Cole had expected. Larkspur Station sat where the north and west roads met, on the high, flat country, a long, low building of mortared stone with a wide porch and a barn out back, large enough for 6 horses at once. His brother had built it, had run it for 9 years with an energy Nathaniel privately envied and quietly mourned, until a fever in the spring had taken him in 4 days and left the station, the debts, and a 10-year-old girl named Etta, all to a younger brother who had spent those same 9 years driving freight and had no particular gift for hosting anyone. Nathaniel was not an unkind man. He was, if anything, a careful one, methodical in the way he mended harness or split wood, the kind of man who noticed when a hinge was a quarter turn from true and fixed it before it failed. But he did not know how to fill a parlor with conversation, did not know what to say to drummers and preachers and homesteading families who stepped off the coach, expecting warmth they could not find in his silences. Etta had taken to serving the coffee herself, standing on a crate to reach the pot, because her uncle would forget the guests were there at all until the coach horn sounded again for departure. He had placed the advertisement because the freight line agent told him plainly that a station without a woman's hand lost custom to the stop 2 days west, and because some nights, lying awake in the room his brother had died in, Nathaniel admitted to himself that the house was too quiet for a girl who had already lost too much. He did not tell himself he was lonely. He told himself the parlor needed a woman's touch, the way a wagon needed a 4th wheel, a practical deficiency requiring a practical remedy. It was easier to think of it that way. The ledger his father had carried from the old country sat on a shelf by the door, a heavy leather book where every traveler who stayed the night was asked to write his name, a habit begun 3 stations and 1 ocean ago, and kept, Nathaniel supposed, because a family that moved as often as his had needed some proof, however small, that they had been somewhere, that somewhere had noticed them passing through. The book was half full of names in half a dozen hands, and Nathaniel privately thought of it as the only record that the house had ever truly been a home to anyone. When the coach pulled up that evening, 3 days ahead of the schedule he had written her, a woman climbed down without waiting for the driver's hand, set her trunk on the porch step herself, and looked at the station the way a person looks at a fence they intend to either mend or tear down, deciding which before they have said a word to anyone. Her name was Josephine Marsh, and she said it plainly, the way she seemed to say everything, without ornament and without apology. She did not offer her hand first. She looked at the house, at the barn, at the girl peering from behind the porch post, and only then at Nathaniel, and something in her gaze made him feel measured rather than greeted. "You're the one who wrote the notice," she said, not quite a question. He said he was. She said she had read it twice on the coach and had questions before she agreed to anything. And Nathaniel, who had expected either a blushing stranger or a desperate one, found himself oddly steadied by her bluntness, the way a man is steadied by a level laid against a wall he has been eyeing with worry. She asked how many meals a week the station served on average, how many rooms needed keeping, whether the girl attended school and who saw to her lessons, if not, and whether the wages promised in the letter were wages he could reliably pay through a hard winter or only a good one. Nathaniel answered each question with the same care he gave to counting lamps, and somewhere in the answering he noticed that she listened not for reassurance, but for fact, the way he himself listened when a man described a wagon he meant to sell him. It was, he thought later, an unusual foundation for a marriage, this mutual insistence on plain accounting, but it was a foundation nonetheless, and foundations were the one thing Nathaniel Cole understood better than most men alive. She did not smile easily, but she did not need to. There was something in the set of her shoulders that told him she had carried weight before and knew the proper way to carry it, without complaint and without letting it show in her step. Etta, who had watched the exchange from the porch post with the particular suspicion of a child who has already lost one home and does not intend to be surprised by the loss of another, finally came forward when Josephine crouched to meet her eye and asked not what her name was, but whether she preferred to be called by it or by some other name entirely, since children, in her experience, often had opinions about such things that adults never bothered to ask. Etta said her name was Etta and no other name would do, and Josephine nodded as though this were the most reasonable answer she had heard all week, and something in Nathaniel's chest loosened slightly, a knot he had not known he was carrying until he felt the first small give of it. She did not ask to see the parlor that night, though it was the room the advertisement had specifically named, the room meant to host the guests he could not host himself. Instead, she asked to see the kitchen and stood in the doorway of it for a long moment with her arms folded, taking in the stove, the shelves, the water barrel, the distance between the table and the door in the manner of a general surveying ground before battle, rather than a woman assessing a home. "This will do," she said finally, which Nathaniel would come to understand over the months that followed was as close to praise as Josephine Marsh allowed herself to give anything on short acquaintance. That first night she slept in the small room off the kitchen that had belonged to no one in particular, and Nathaniel lay awake in his brother's old room, listening to the wind move over the flat country outside, thinking that he had hired a housekeeper who spoke like a merchant and looked at a room like an engineer, and wondering, with the small, persistent unease of a man who has just made an irreversible decision, whether he had asked for a wife and been sent something else entirely, something he did not yet have the words to name. She did not host his guests the way he had imagined hosting to look, with easy chatter and quick laughter passed around a table like bread. What Josephine did in the first weeks at Larkspur Station was something closer to the way a good foreman runs a crew, a thing Nathaniel recognized because it resembled his own quiet competence more than it resembled the warmth he had thought he was purchasing with his careful advertisement. She rose before the sun and had the stove going before the first coach of the week was a speck on the North Road, and by the time the passengers stepped down stiff-legged and irritable from the jolting ride, there was coffee poured and a meal set that required no apology, no explanation, no nervous hovering at the door waiting to be told it was adequate. She did not ask travelers about their business, did not pry into where they had come from or where they were bound. And yet somehow, within a quarter hour of arriving, most of them found themselves telling her anyway, unprompted, the way a man will tell a fence post his troubles if the fence post happens to be standing still and listening. Nathaniel watched this from the doorway of the barn more evenings than he admitted to himself, watched drummers who had complained of the road all the way from the last station leave Larkspur with their collars loosened and their voices lighter, watched a widow traveling west with 3 children accept a second cup of coffee from Josephine's hand and say, with something close to wonder, that this was the first stop on the whole journey where she had felt like a person and not merely a fare. It was not warmth exactly, not the kind that announced itself with open arms and easy tears. It was something steadier than that, a kind of attention that made a stranger feel accounted for, the way a good ledger accounts for every name that passes through a door. Etta took to her slowly and then all at once, the way children often do with adults, who do not perform affection but simply supply it, consistently without asking to be thanked. Josephine taught her to read the account books alongside her lessons. On the theory stated plainly one evening at the supper table that a girl who understood numbers would never have to depend entirely on the good faith of any man to know whether she was being treated fairly, a statement that made Nathaniel look up from his plate with an expression he did not entirely understand himself, something between admiration and a faint, unnamed unease. He began to notice small things about her that the advertisement had never asked for and that he had not known to want. The way she counted coin twice before setting it in the strongbox quietly, as though the counting itself were a habit worn into her hands by some old necessity rather than mere carefulness. The way she flinched, almost imperceptibly, when a man raised his voice at the supper table over a spilled cup, though she recovered so quickly that he might have imagined it if he had not seen it happen twice more in as many weeks. The way she wrote letters on Sunday afternoons, sealed them herself rather than leaving them for him to carry with the station's outgoing mail, and walked the mile to the crossroads post herself to send them, refusing his offer to ride her there in weather that made the walk plainly unpleasant. He did not ask about the letters. It was not, he told himself, any business of a man who had married a woman for practical reasons to inquire after her correspondence, though he noticed that she read the returning letters, when they came, in the barn rather than the house, standing near the far stall where the light was poor and the privacy was better, and that she always folded them small enough to fit inside her sleeve before she came back in. They had married 11 days after her arrival in the parlor she was meant to host guests in, with Otis Pruitt the blacksmith standing as witness because he happened to be at the station delivering a mended axle, and the traveling minister happened to be passing through on the same coach as a drummer selling patent tonics. A coincidence Otis found so amusing he repeated it to every customer in his shop for a month afterward. It had not been a ceremony either of them dressed up in more feeling than it required. Nathaniel had said his vows the way he said most things, plainly and without flourish, and Josephine had said hers the same way. And if there was a tremor in her voice on the final line, Nathaniel told himself it was the cold, since the parlor stove had not yet been lit that morning. Otis, watching the two of them stand a careful foot apart, even as the minister pronounced them married, had leaned toward Nathaniel afterward and said, in the dry voice he used for observations he considered self-evident, that he had seen livestock auctions conducted with more visible affection, and that he hoped, for both their sakes, the marriage improved on acquaintance the way most sound investments did. It was, Nathaniel reflected, not an unfair assessment, and yet something had improved, slowly in the months since, something he could not have named to Otis or to anyone, a kind of settling that had nothing to do with declarations and everything to do with the way Josephine had begun, without announcing it, to write her own name beneath his in the old leather ledger by the door, not as a guest passing through, but as a fixture of the place, the way a beam becomes a fixture once it has borne weight through a hard winter. He found himself on evenings when the coach was late and the house was quiet, watching her hands as she mended a shirt or totaled the week's accounts, and thinking that he had asked for a woman to host his guests, and had received instead a woman who was slowly, methodically, without any performance of feeling at all, building something that resembled a family out of the plain materials at hand, the way she might build anything else she considered worth the effort. He did not yet understand what the letters meant, or why she counted coin the way she did, or why her eyes went distant and careful whenever a stranger asked where she had come from before Larkspur. But he understood. In the wordless way he understood a wagon wheel was sound or a fence post was rotten, that whatever she carried folded small in her sleeve was heavier than she let it appear, and that a man who had married for practical reasons owed his wife, at minimum, the patience not to demand an accounting before she was ready to give one. The letters kept coming through the autumn, arriving with a regularity that Nathaniel, who noticed patterns the way other men noticed weather, could not help but track without meaning to. They came every third week, always in the same careful hand, and Josephine always walked to the crossroads post to send her replies herself rather than trust them to the station's outgoing mailbag, a small habit that told him more than any words could have, that she considered this correspondence a private province, one she had not yet decided to open to him. He did not ask. He told himself this was respect, and it was. But it was also a kind of fear he did not examine too closely, the fear that asking might unearth something he was not yet prepared to hear, and that a man who had built a marriage on plain practical footing had no right to demand more intimacy than the footing allowed. Etta noticed, too, in the unguarded way, children notice things adults try to conceal, and one evening, while helping Josephine fold linens, asked outright who wrote to her so often, and whether it was a sister, since Josephine had once mentioned in passing that she had left family behind when she came west. Josephine's hands had stilled on the linen for just a moment, a pause so brief that only someone already watching for such pauses would have caught it, and then she said evenly that yes, it was family, and changed the subject to whether Etta had finished her sums, a redirection so smooth that Etta did not think to press further, though Nathaniel, standing in the doorway with an armload of firewood, caught the pause and carried it with him the rest of the evening, like a stone in his boot. It was Otis Pruitt, of all people, who first said the thing aloud that Nathaniel had been circling without landing on for weeks. The blacksmith had ridden out to deliver a set of new hinges for the barn door, and stayed for coffee, as he often did. And at some point in the conversation, watching Josephine cross the yard toward the well with the particular economy of motion she brought to every task, Otis remarked, in the dry tone he reserved for things he considered obvious to everyone but the person he was speaking to, that a woman did not learn to count coin twice and flinch at raised voices and refuse help with a mile's walk in bad weather without having lived through something a man ought to want to know about before he called her wife in truth as well as in name. Nathaniel had not answered right away. He had watched Josephine draw the bucket, watched the ease with which she balanced its weight against her hip, and thought that Otis, for all his bluntness, had simply said plainly what Nathaniel himself had been too careful or too afraid to put into words. "She'll tell me when she's ready," he said finally, and Otis had shrugged and said that readiness sometimes needed inviting, the way a shy horse needed a hand extended before it would come to the fence on its own, and that a man who waited too long for readiness sometimes found he had waited past the point where trust could still be freely given, rather than forced. The invitation, when it came, was not one Nathaniel offered on purpose. It came because a coach arrived one raw afternoon in late autumn carrying, among its usual assortment of drummers and homesteaders, a man Nathaniel had never seen before, travel-worn and grim-faced, who asked at the door not for a room or a meal, but specifically for Josephine Marsh, using her maiden name with a flat insistence that told Nathaniel, even before introductions were made, that this was not an ordinary traveler passing through. Josephine had gone very still in the kitchen doorway at the sound of the name, still in the particular way of someone who has heard a sound she has been dreading for a long time and has run out of road to keep dreading it from a distance. The man introduced himself as Wendell Marsh, brother to Josephine's late husband, and said he had come a long way to discuss the matter of the boy, and something in the words The matter of the boy struck the kitchen silent in a way that made even Etta, setting the table nearby, pause with a fork half raised and look between the adults with the wide, careful eyes of a child sensing weather about to break. Nathaniel felt the floor of his understanding shift beneath him, not violently, but with the slow, sickening give of ground he had trusted and should not have. A boy, a husband, dead, unspoken of in 11 days of courtship and 11 weeks of marriage. He looked at Josephine and saw, for the first time since her trunk had come off the coach that first evening, something in her face that was not composure but its opposite, held together by will alone, and he understood, with the plain clarity he brought to a cracked axle or a rotten post, that whatever she had been carrying folded small in her sleeve all these months had just arrived at his door in the flesh, wearing a traveling coat and demanding to be heard. She told him that night, after Wendell Marsh had been given a room and Etta had been put to bed, with more reassurance than explanation, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, with her hands folded so tightly the knuckles had gone pale, that she had a son, 4 years old, named Tobias, left in the care of her sister back east, because she had come west with almost nothing, no money, no certainty of a place to land, and had judged, rightly or wrongly, that a woman answering an advertisement for a wife with a small child in tow would find every door closed before she had finished knocking. She said she had meant to tell him, had rehearsed the telling a dozen times in the months since her arrival, but that each rehearsal had ended the same way, with the fear that a man who had specifically advertised for a wife to host his guests and help raise his niece would not welcome the addition of a stranger's child, however much that child was hers, however much her heart ached with every letter that told her Tobias had grown another inch or lost another tooth in her absence. She said her husband had died of a lung fever 2 winters past, that his family had blamed her for the debts he left behind, though she had never seen a cent of them spent, and that Wendell Marsh, sitting now in the room down the hall, had made it plain in every letter since that he considered her an unfit mother for having left the boy behind at all, regardless of the reasons, and that he had come, she was certain, not out of family feeling, but to take Tobias from her permanently, on the grounds that a woman who would abandon a child to chase a stranger's advertisement had no true claim to be called his mother. She said all of this without tears, in the same plain accounting voice she used for the week's ledgers, though her hands, folded so tightly on the table, told a different story than her voice did, and Nathaniel, watching those hands, understood that the composure was not coldness, but the last available shelter of a woman who had learned, long before she ever answered his advertisement, that showing the depth of a wound only invited someone to press on it. He did not say anything for a long moment, and the silence stretched between them with a weight that made Josephine's shoulders draw in slightly, as though she were bracing for a blow she had absorbed before and expected again now. When he finally spoke, it was not the question she seemed to have braced for. He asked plainly whether she wanted the boy here at Larkspur with them, and whether that was a want she had simply never allowed herself to say aloud because she believed it would cost her the roof over her head to say it. She looked at him for a long time before she answered, and when she did, her voice had lost some of its careful steadiness, breaking just slightly on the single word, yes, as though the admission itself required more courage than anything else she had done since stepping off that first coach. Nathaniel nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he had finally located the source of a rattle in a wagon axle after long searching, a nod that carried relief as much as resolution. "Then he comes here," he said. "That's the whole of it." It was not a grand declaration. It was, in its way, no more than a practical decision plainly stated, the kind of sentence Nathaniel Cole had built his whole character upon, and yet Josephine's face in the lamplight moved through something that looked almost like the beginning of tears before she caught herself, and simply nodded back, as though they had settled a matter of fencing rather than the shape of the rest of both their lives. Wendell Marsh did not accept the matter as settled quite so easily. He stayed 3 days at Larkspur Station, ostensibly waiting for the next coach east, and in that time he made his position clear to anyone who would listen, including, pointedly, to Nathaniel himself over coffee on the second morning, saying that a man newly married to a woman he barely knew ought to think carefully before taking on the burden of another man's child. That blood family had rights the law would recognize over a stranger's whims, and that he intended to write to his lawyer about pursuing guardianship the moment he reached a proper town with a telegraph office. He said it in the tone of a man laying out facts rather than threats, which made it, if anything, more unsettling, since facts carried a weight that threats did not always manage. Nathaniel listened to all of it without much visible reaction, in the manner that had made men underestimate him his whole life, and when Wendell finished, he asked only one question in return: whether Wendell, in the 2 years since his brother's death, had once sent money or a letter or any word at all to the sister-in-law he now called unfit before this visit. Wendell's silence answered the question more completely than any speech could have. "A man doesn't get to claim a debt he never once tried to pay," Nathaniel said, and though his voice stayed level, there was something in it, some quiet finality that made even Otis Pruitt, who happened to be present mending a strap by the door, look up with an expression of frank respect he did not often show anyone. The stand Nathaniel took was not made in a single dramatic confrontation, though the coffee table exchange came closest to one. It was made in a series of small, practical acts stretched over the following weeks, the kind of acts that had always been his particular language of devotion, long before he had a wife to spend that language on. He wrote to a lawyer of his own in the territorial capital, a man he had done freight business with for years, and trusted the way he trusted a well-oiled axle, and asked plainly what steps a stepfather might take to secure a child's place in a household against a contesting relative who had shown neither care nor support in the years since the child's father died. He began, without announcement, converting the small room off the kitchen where Josephine had first slept into a proper room for a boy, building a narrow bed frame himself in the evenings after supper, sanding the corners smooth with the same careful attention he gave any joint that would bear weight for years to come. He said nothing of this to Josephine directly, but she found the half-built frame one evening while fetching linens and stood looking at it for a long while before she came and found him in the barn. And though she did not say much, what she did say, plain and simple as everything else she had ever told him, was that she had not expected a man to build a bed for a child he had never met, sight unseen on nothing more than his wife's asking. "Wasn't much asking," Nathaniel said, not looking up from the strap he was mending. "You said yes. That was the whole of it." It was, in its plainness, the closest thing to a declaration of love either of them had yet spoken, and Josephine, standing in the barn doorway with the lamplight behind her, understood it exactly as it was meant, and did not need it dressed in finer words to feel its full weight. The lawyer's reply came 3 weeks later, along with the practical guidance that a formal petition for guardianship, filed properly and promptly, backed by a stable household and a willing stepfather, would very likely prevail over a contesting relative who had provided no support and made no prior claim in 2 full years, particularly given that the child's mother remained alive, capable, and entirely willing. Nathaniel filed the petition himself, riding 2 full days to the territorial seat to do it in person rather than trust it to the mail, and Josephine, watching him ride out at dawn with the papers folded carefully inside his coat, understood that this was, in its own unadorned way, as clear a vow as any spoken in the parlor 11 weeks before. Wendell Marsh, informed by letter of the petition and the lawyer's opinion of its likely success, did not pursue the matter further. He sent one final letter, terse and bitter, declaring he washed his hands of the whole business, and Josephine read it standing at the kitchen table, and this time did not walk out to the barn to read it alone, but read it there, in front of Nathaniel and Etta both, and when she finished, she folded it once, plainly, and set it in the stove without ceremony, watching it catch and curl and blacken with an expression that was, for the first time since Nathaniel had known her, entirely unguarded. The boy arrived on a coach in early winter, 4 years old and solemn-eyed, clutching a small wooden horse someone had carved for him and wearing a coat 2 sizes too large. Sent along, Josephine explained later, by the sister who had cared for him and who had, in her own letters, expressed nothing but relief that the matter had been settled in her sister's favor. Nathaniel watched from the porch as Josephine came down the steps, faster than he had ever seen her move, faster than any account book or ledger had ever prompted her to hurry, and gathered the boy up before his feet had properly touched the ground, holding him with a fierceness that made the whole station, for a moment, forget the wind and the cold and everything else the frontier demanded of a person simply to survive it. Etta hung back near the porch post, watching with the particular caution of a child, uncertain whether a new arrival meant less room for herself in a family she had only recently begun to trust. And it was Josephine, still holding Tobias, who reached out her free hand toward Etta and said, plainly, that the house was big enough for 2 children who would need to learn to be something like sisters, since neither of them had asked for the family they'd ended up with. But both of them had ended up loved in it all the same, which was, in Josephine's accounting, the only part of the arrangement that actually mattered. That evening, after the boy had been fed and settled in the narrow bed frame Nathaniel had built with his own hands, and after Etta had grudgingly, then genuinely shown him where the good hiding spots in the barn were kept, Nathaniel found Josephine standing by the old leather ledger near the door, the one his father had carried from the old country, the one every traveler who stayed the night was asked to sign. She had it open to a fresh page, pen in hand, and when he came to stand beside her, she wrote, beneath her own name and his, the name Tobias Marsh Cole, in the same careful hand she used for the week's accounts, though her hand trembled slightly on the final letter in a way it never had over a column of figures. Guests sign it when they pass through, she said, not quite looking at him. I thought it was time somebody signed it who meant to stay. Nathaniel looked at the page for a long moment, at the small collection of names that had accumulated there since a girl and a woman, and now a boy, had come to a house that had once been kept for strangers, and had slowly, without either of them fully choosing it, become something else entirely. He did not say anything grand in response, because grand was not a language he had ever learned to speak, and Josephine had never asked him to learn it. He simply took the pen from her hand when she had finished, and beneath the new name, in his own plain block letters, wrote a single line that needed no further explanation to either of them. This house is not a stop along the road anymore. Outside, the wind moved over the flat winter country the way it always had, indifferent to the small, warm room and the lamp burning steady in its window. But inside, for the first time since his brother's death, had left him alone with a station full of strangers passing through, Nathaniel Cole understood that he had not, in fact, advertised for a woman to host his guests. He had, without knowing it, been waiting all along for someone to walk through that door and make the house itself into something worth returning to. And in the leather ledger by the door, beneath 4 names now instead of 1, the proof of it sat written down in plain, ordinary ink, exactly the way Josephine had always preferred her truths to be told.